This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
He is an innovator and entrepreneur looking to upend traditional ways cancer and diabetes are treated. Dr. Zhen Gu on this edition of Conversations. Dr. Zhen Gu's mother believed he might one day grow up and cure cancer. While he hasn't yet, it's not for lack of trying. Dr. Gu, a biomedical engineer and professor at UCLA, is engaged in cutting-edge treatments for cancer and diabetes. In addition to his role as a professor at UCLA, he has co-founded 5 startup companies. We welcome Dr. Zhen Gu to Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here.
It is absolutely my pleasure. Tell me about your childhood when you first, what was it that first got you interested in science and medicine?
Yeah, actually it's like, I always interested in this kind of things like in nature.
Right.
And I actually play a lot this kind of small things to get this kind of insects.
Right.
And also play with water, fire, to make this kind of, experiments, even some try this, that, Yeah, actually it's like a...
Now, your father passed away when you were very, very young, correct, from cancer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually around 4 months old, yeah.
When you were 4 months
Yeah, probably
old.
repeated, yeah.
Yeah. And so that was kind of one of the things that your mother, I guess, had read that, hey, one day you might grow up and be the one that cures cancer.
Yeah, actually, she never expected that, this moment I can do something, for treating cancer.
Right.
And especially, once I was 4 months old, my father actually died of leukemia.
Okay.
And once my mom actually pregnant with me, and my dad is diagnosed with leukemia. And at that moment, how do you say it? Some friends, also some relatives try to kind of suggest to my mom get some abortion,
right.
Because that moment the family is really poor, and then could be easier for life. Right. But my mom said potentially this guy may help treat the cancer. Yeah. So yeah, this story.
And what a great story, and you're certainly working in that direction. Tell me a little bit about some of the things that you're working on. I mean, you're kind of known for some of your research and innovation in diabetes. Tell me more about that.
Yes, actually, there's also some a personal connection. My grandma is suffer from diabetes for many years, and I know this kind of things really painful. I play this kind of syringes when I was a boy, and it's that moment I inject this kind of different things to tomatoes, potatoes, right? Right. And but at that moment I just know that diabetes is really a certain burden, and people really painful, and they needed the insulin every day, this kind of multiple injections. And today actually we are working on this kind of drug delivery systems, and to potentially help people with diabetes. Especially we developed this kind of smart insulin patch. Okay. And actually this is a combination of the, let's say the painless microneedle patch together with the glucose responsive insulin delivery formulation inside. Okay. So actually I bring some sample here, and you can take a look.
And I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold it up here to the camera, and I'll get you to kind of explain what this is here. And so there it is. It almost looks like a Band-Aid, and if you were to touch it, just not just little small. I'm going to call them needles, but they're not really like needles, are they? What exactly is it? I'll get you to explain it better.
Yeah, actually, it's it's made by some a polymer. Mm-hmm. All the needles, including the let's say the bedding stuff, is with the polymeric stuff, and they actually loaded the with the insulin inside, encapsulated inside, and meanwhile they can respond to the glucose level, especially once the blood sugar level goes high, and then such materials can be smartly sense this kind of high glucose level and release the insulin outside. So insulin actually is a hormone protein, actually can help reduce the glucose level, actually to promote the cells eat the glucose from the bloodstream, and then to help reduce the glucose level. And meanwhile, you can see that the each microneedle is like really tiny. And it's like the length or the height about like 600 to 800 micrometer.
Okay.
And typically, let's say the nerve cells underneath our skin is like 1,000 micrometer from the skin. Okay. So that means once such patch interact with the skin, they won't like interact with the nerve cells that significantly. So that's why we call it like a painless based method. So that means compared to the general injection, much better.
Yeah, because someone who is on insulin, who is a diabetic, actually has to give themselves a shot, and that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes,
And that's painful.
Yeah.
And so this would help alleviate some of that. And now you can put it on, as I understand it, for an extended period of time. Is that correct?
Yes, and you can actually, for example, before the meals, and then you can put the patch there, like to the belly or to the arm, and then they can sense the glucose level and release the insulin. We call it like at the right time.
Oh, it senses the glucose level.
You are right. You are
Yes.
right. So especially once the glucose level becomes high, and then the insulin can be released from certain patch.
Okay. Now, is that designed specifically for me, or is it more? In other words, would you design one specifically for Jeff, or is it kind of broad ranging? I guess is my question.
Yeah, actually, this is a great question. So we can based on the the average glucose level, and we design like several different patches with a different like amount of the insulin and the glucose sensing component inside.
Okay.
So then
potentially
can achieve the so-called like personalized medication.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Neat.
So
now, where is this in development right now?
So actually, we let's say run a startup company like 4 years ago, and we later received the investments. And then especially these days we typically focused on the large animal study. Okay. So we already successfully tested on the so-called type 1 diabetic pigs. Okay.
Oh, diabetic pigs.
Yeah, think about that. Actually, 4 years ago, we tested on the mice. Okay. And each mouse is like 20 gram. Okay. Right. So it's like compared to the average, our human beings, like around like 60 or 70 kilogram. Actually, it's really small, right? Right. And at that moment, actually, people like even like wrote an email to me, said, okay, it's really far away for human usage. Right. Yeah, right. Because think about the dosage, right? And actually, in that email, he or she even mentioned that help me to calculate how large for the human usage. So this could be like a 60 centimeter times 70 centimeter. So this is really huge. Like you need to wear some like a microneedle jacket, right? And push like from back to the front, and then to do this kind of thing. So then we run this kind of company. Actually, we further develop this kind of technology, and we apply some like a new mechanism together, like to further optimize the loading capacity, the amounts of the insulin inside, and then significantly enhance the amount of of the insulin in the patch. And even now it's like still like this kind of small size, like you see that, right? Right. And we can load like a lot of insulin inside, and one patch especially can control the glucose level of 30 kilogram, 30 kilogram, weights, the mini pigs. Okay. Like for like up to 24 hours for 1 day. Okay. So then potentially like one patch like for 1 day, or like 2 or 3 patches for every day, based on the the general conditions of people with diabetes. What will this do from a cost savings standpoint? I mean, what does it have the potential to cost the patient a lot less than traditional insulin? Or? Yeah, so based on our like rough calculations, like actually it's not that expensive. Like let's talk about the cost of each patch at this moment based on our current manufacturing process, and it could be like around 25 to 50 cents or 1 to 2 quarters. Actually, it's okay. Yeah. Okay. And so now, does this still have to have approval by the FDA? Is it still? Are we still at that stage, or? Yes, as I said, it's like we currently test on the pigs. Okay. And we already like submitted the pre-IND application to FDA, and we also received like this kind of advice from FDA, and we also joined the so-called emerging technology program. okay, and closely work with the FDA for the potential clinical trials.
Okay. What would be your time frame that you would like to see this come to market? Or, I mean, I'm sure you'd like to see it come to market right away, but realistically speaking, what's the time frame for it to be in the market where patients can actually use it?
Yes, actually, this is certainly based on the the future development, like clinical trials, right, and to evaluate the safety as well as the efficacy of this kind of patch, and hopefully, like after let's say 4 to 5 years, yeah,
4 to 5 years out. 4 to 5 years out. Diabetes is a major problem. I mean, could we say it's reached epidemic proportions in the U.S., if not globally?
Yes, currently actually diabetes is really global burden, like affecting around 400 million people.
400 million people are diabetic.
Yes, you are right.
Okay.
And if like keep this kind of trend, let's say 20 years later, this number could be like around 600 million people.
600 million people.
Yeah.
Will be diabetics.
Diabetes. And at that moment, if we still keep this kind of trend, in US, actually 1 in 3 Americans will have diabetes.
And there's type 1 diabetes and there's type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
On a percentage basis, I'm quite confident, I think, that type 2 diabetes is well out ahead. Is that
yes? So
correct?
Yes, more like people with type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Yeah.
So explain to the audience, what is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. And let's say type 1 or type 2, this is actually totally two different diseases, let's say, although like or both diabetes. Right. The type 1 actually associated with the immune attacking. So that means the people's like immune system like attack the beta cells. Then the beta cells, which can generate the insulin, actually damage it. Okay. And then they can't produce insulin at its needs. Okay. So no insulin generated.
Okay.
Typically.
Okay.
And especially, some people like even like, let's say little kids, like a 1 year or 2 year old, they develop type 1 diabetes. Right, okay. Right. And for people with type 2 diabetes, actually the beta cells still there. They can still produce insulin. Okay. But somehow develop the insulin resistance.
Okay.
Okay. So that means, previously like insulin just like a key to open the door, let the glucose go inside to cells, right? Uh-huh. And for the normal people, like the healthy people, is like typically one key to open one door, let the glucose go inside to cells. But for people with type 2 diabetes, like more keys are needed to open one door to let the glucose go inside to cells. So that's why for both people with type 1 and advanced type 2 diabetes, they need insulin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. Type 2 diabetes, is that something that you are genetically predisposed to, or is that something that you can have a little bit more control over?
Yeah, it's like as long as people, need the insulin, especially for, the type 1 diabetes, this is like a lifelong like usage, right? Right. And for type 2 diabetes, for the early stage, you can still like improve it. It can be like reversible, and through this kind of diet control or like exercise, you can still like maintain the activity of the beta cells. Right. But like with the further developments, we call it like a later stage of type 2 diabetes, then the insulin is like really essential. Yeah.
Okay. I've heard some, and I don't want to get, I'm not sure if this is exactly kind of in your area of expertise, but I'm sort of curious that I've heard some people say that if you have, I guess particularly type 2 diabetes, that you may be possibly running a greater risk to have issues like Alzheimer's and things of that nature. Is your research indicating anything along those lines?
For people with diabetes, many like complications may happen, for example, associated with cardiovascular diseases, associated with the cancer, also. So there's some like close research, actually like ongoing studies, associated with the relationship between the diabetes and other diseases actually ongoing. Yeah. Okay.
Very good. Now, let's talk a little bit about cancer. So you're working on cancer research as well. So tell me what you're doing in that area.
Yeah, and typically for our studies associated with cancer, it's like we really want to develop the drug delivery systems which could like boost the efficacy of the anti-cancer drug. Could be small molecule drug or like large molecule based like antibodies. To enhance their treatment efficacy and meanwhile potentially reduce the toxicity, the side effects of the certain drugs. And so, for example, we leverage the targeting capability of the platelets as carriers to deliver anti-cancer drug. Actually platelets, naturally they can target to the bleeding site, okay, to the wound site.
Okay.
So then, clinically, like let's say the doctors remove the primary tumor.
Okay.
Okay. But it's really challenging to completely remove all the tumor tissues.
Right.
One thing is like really hard to identify this kind of micro tumor or radical tumor.
Okay.
In this kind of a surgical site, right? And then after surgery, the tumor can quickly come back.
Right.
We call it like tumor recurrence, and also certainly associated with the metastasis. Okay, and this is one thing. And the second thing is like even like doctors identify this kind of tumor tissues, but sometimes hesitate to cut them because it may potentially affect the function of the patients. For example, like brain tumors.
Right. Right.
And then through all this kind of platelets-based drug delivery system, and during the surgery, we can infuse the platelets with the drug, like antibody, for example, like an immune checkpoint blocker therapy, so-called like associated with immunotherapy. And then this kind of platelets can target to the bleeding site associated with the surgery, and then bring this kind of drug to the surgical site, and then to perform the sustained release, to release the drug gradually. And then, can potentially like inhibit the tumor recurrence, also like metastasis after surgery.
Okay.
So this is actually one application, and we also like link this kind of platelets drug, to the stem cell, like the hematopoietic stem cell.
Okay.
And this kind of stem cell actually they can home to the bone marrow naturally. So then they can bring the drug to the bone marrow, and especially to perform the bone marrow associated cancer immunotherapy, especially for treating leukemia.
Okay.
So because, for example, the acute myeloid leukemia, so-called AML, actually many patients like with this, chemotherapy, but after that, like around like 1/3 patients develop the tumor recurrence, especially from the bone marrow, and it's usually quite challenging, to deliver drug, to the bone marrow sites.
Right.
So then through our like cell-based delivery method, to leverage the homing capability of the stem cell to the bone marrow, and then we can, deliver the drug to the bone marrow to perform this kind of treatment.
Okay.
So this is kind of another application, yeah.
So essentially what you're doing is you're going in and you're targeting the bad cells, so to speak.
Yes. So, yes. So basically it's like we, apply this kind of delivery tools, delivery vehicles, to bring the drug to the disease site.
Right.
And regarding the strategy approach, especially we apply, this kind of either live cells, this kind of particles already inside our body, like platelets, like stem cells.
Right.
Like recently we even apply the fat cells as this kind of drug delivery tools, to deliver drug. And some actually cells like platelets, people found that they actually closely interact with the tumor cells, even like help the tumor cell, transport to other places to develop the metastasis. So actually play a better role, okay? And however, through this kind of drug delivery system design, we can convert their function to make them as a Trojan horse.
Okay.
To carry this kind of drug, because they interact with the tumor cells very closely. So then they can bring the drug to the tumor cells and then to, kill the tumor cells. So this is actually a strategy we call it like a Trojan horse-based strategy.
Interesting, interesting. Because the traditional way of treating cancer, I guess the various drugs oftentimes kill the good cells and the bad cells, correct?
Yeah. And you talk about actually another thing is like how to reduce the side effects.
Right.
For example, currently, as I just mentioned, the immune checkpoint blocker therapy. Actually, this is really popular and clinically really show, tremendous, positive outcomes. Okay. However, side effects there. Okay, because typically let's say briefly, the mechanism is like to activate these kind of immune cells, allow them to re-recognize the tumor cells, through this kind of antibody, and then to attack the tumor cells, cancer cells. Okay. However, with such treatment, the immune cells can also attack the normal cells, and if we attack normal cells, then some severe inflammation may happen. For example, associated with cardiovascular diseases, associated with the even type 1 diabetes, because if the immune cells attack the normal beta cells and destroy the beta cells, and then the glucose level goes up, associated with diabetes we just introduced. And then how to reduce this kind of toxicity? This is another thing, why we want to apply the drug delivery systems. Okay, not only just boost the efficacy, but also potentially reduce the toxicity. For example, we can perform the local and targeted delivery systems, and just bring the drug, or accumulate the drug, to the disease site, and then the systemic dosage can be reduced. Okay, and then the potential toxicity can be reduced. Okay, so this is kind of another advantage of why we apply the drug delivery systems. Okay, and certainly, we talk about the boost the efficacy, reduce side effects, and another things to further improve the patient's compliance.
Okay.
So that's why we apply this kind of painless microneedle array patch, because for people with diabetes, they use this kind of insulin every day, right?
Right.
And through this kind of patch with very short microneedle, and then the feeding could be improved.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. As far as going back to cancer for a moment, how far away are we to finding a cure for cancer?
Yeah, so this is actually, why, many researchers are currently working on this and trying to develop the new technologies. And indeed, it's really tough,
Yeah.
And especially, let's say the whole procedure, the whole process, to fight cancer is very challenging, because, some people develop new drugs, and they show really powerful effect. But meanwhile, the tumor can also develop some a mechanism to fight back.
Right.
Okay, to get this kind of so-called drug resistance. Okay, for example, right?
Right.
And then, for example, the tumor at the very beginning could shrink, and after a certain while, they can come back. Okay, so that's why it's another thing is why more these kind of innovations in this field associated with new drug discovery, associated with new drug delivery system, are essentially needed. Okay, so I mean, the answer is not clear. Okay, so it's still that's why it's we need this kind of the cancer associated studies today. Yeah.
Okay. What is your typical day like? What do you focus on when you go into the lab or whatever every day? What's your focus? What are you trying to accomplish every day?
Yeah, actually, this moment, I mean, besides our research, working with students, and certainly family was important, and
right.
play with my son. Actually, this is
right. Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you go into the lab every day and you're thinking, or I want to work on a particular area of healthcare, or work on above and beyond cancer or diabetes, or are those your main two focuses?
And another thing is I want to say besides innovation, and we are really interested in translating our technologies to bring the technology, from the bench to the bedside as soon as possible. This is actually really, our, particular focus today. Okay. And especially associated with the drug delivery systems, how to shorten the gap between the bench to the bedside is very important. Okay. And so that's why actually we run the startup companies, okay? And especially, we saw about that, certainly you can quickly license your technology to the big pharma, right?
Right.
But for some early stage technologies, actually people know this kind of characteristics, properties of your new technologies. So then, at very early stage, you should really take them as a baby. To perform the further development. So based on this, I saw about that the startup company could really help could really help,
Yeah.
And especially with this kind of investment, for example, like to my diabetes, the smart insulin patch associated company was also to my cancer immunotherapy formulation company, with certain like investments, we can really look into this kind of certain improvements or optimization of these kind of formulations. And we can also test on the large animal model, to further validate this kind of efficacy as well as safety. So then can potentially easily or within relatively short period of time to bring the technology for the human test. Yeah. So this is the motivation why we also want to run these kind of companies.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. I guess I have about 3 minutes left in the program here. What are you most excited about? What are you most excited about in medical technology?
Many moments, associated with this kind of, the exciting discovery, exciting this kind of improvements, even this kind of small animal model, we show this kind of efficacy, we show some reduction of the side effects, actually really, made myself excited.
Right.
And especially also we receive emails, for example, from the patients, almost every day. It's from people with diabetes or from cancer, and they actually sometimes really want to follow this kind of development, progress. Okay, and for example, yesterday I received an email from people with type 1 diabetes, and they follow up our microneedle development and ask how close to the human test.
Right.
And for every email, and we actually reply to them and to update our progress. Especially we mentioned that now we currently closely work with the FDA, trying to next step. Yeah.
Well, you are doing absolutely fascinating work. I do wish you all the very best, and thank you for spending some time with us.
Yeah.
Take wonderful care. Thank you. Dr. Zhen Gu, he is an entrepreneur, an innovator, professor at UCLA, and working on some very interesting stuff in the world of medical technology. By the way, you can see a lot more of our conversations online at wsre.org/conversations, as well as on YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.